Thank you, Generals. Let's move on to the Q&A session. Please state your name and media affiliation before asking the questions. Let's start over here. Yeah.
Thank you, Ana Pisonero from the Spanish news agency La Papeles. I'd like to know if the CHODs discussed the possibility of beefing up NATO's response in the fight of terrorism, and particularly the Islamic State, in the light of the possible assessment that you got from your Algerian and Israeli counterparts on the situation of the north of Africa and the Middle East, and also taking into account presumably one of the main key interests of the new administration of Donald Trump for the alliance, which is to step up the fight against terrorism. Thank you.
Okay, I think I will take the first part and will leave the second to my American colleague. In terms of NATO response to counterterrorism, I believe that NATO is already doing a lot to support counterterrorism efforts. First, being present and active in Afghanistan, then supporting a number of activities in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And we have to understand that counterterrorism is not just a physical fight against terrorists. Counterterrorism has a number of levels and facets, and NATO is contributing to many of them and will contribute even more. We are working on bringing these efforts more closely together to give them more coherence and thus more effectiveness. NATO will continue supporting activities, especially in training, preparation of specialists of the countries mostly affected by terrorism, and give them more local capabilities to be effective in this endeavor.
I would just add that coming out of Warsaw, we had the directive of NATO Strategic Direction South, and also projecting stability in the form, for instance, of our training effort that we began this month in Iraq, and all of those are indications of NATO's commitment to fight and counter terrorism. And so as we go into the future in SHAPE and ACO, we're studying now ways in which we reinforce that network that defeats the ISIL and terrorist network globally. And I'm confident that we are doing a lot today, and we'll do more in the future.
Julian Barnes, Wall Street Journal. I want to follow up on that question. Leaving us first for General Scaparrotti, and then another question for General Pavel. For General Scaparrotti, leaving aside building partnership capacity, is there a military counterterrorism role for NATO, or is that best left for coalitions like we see for the Islamic State fight? Should NATO its counterterrorism efforts solely be focused on the kind of partnership capacity stuff that you outlined here? And for General Pavel, I wonder if you could briefly speak a little bit more about Ukraine. Is there any fear that the U.S. approach to Ukraine will shift, and was there any discussion of what more the alliance could do for Ukraine in the months to come?
Julian, thank you. I don't think it is solely projecting stability. For instance, I talked about the network that we formed globally. It's the coalition network to defeat the ISIL or the terrorist network. We in NATO have 28 nations with a process, a structure that enables us to collect and share information, to analyze information, and that is a powerful part of countering terrorism. We can reinforce that global network that's going on right now with the nodes that we have within NATO. Secondly, I just point out things like the AWACS operations that we've started now that support the coalition in Iraq, etc. So we do have capacity. Those are the things that we're looking at, and that's what I look for to the future of being able to leverage to help the coalition and other nations.
On Ukraine, there is no reason to believe that there will be any change of the main course towards Ukraine. We are working with our Ukrainian partners, especially on increasing their capability and capacity. through the trust funds, through different training programs, through expert exchange, through liaison teams in place. There is a comprehensive assistance package developed for Ukraine, and that package provides a sufficient framework for the way ahead. Ukrainian armed forces are under the process of reorganization, modernization, and they are adjusting to new realities. So I think we will continue in this course in future as well.
Nurdin Fried from Al Arabiya News Channel. I have a couple of questions. You are supposed to have a briefing yesterday from your Israeli and Algerian counterpart about the situation in North Africa and the Middle East. Can you tell us what is your view, your analysis of the situation in Libya, its impact on Tunisia, Algeria, and the Sahel, but also what is your view on the situation in Syria after the Aleppo, let's say, defeat of the opposition and the Russian building up more generally? How do we see the Russian military building up in the Mediterranean? Is it going up, or maybe they are going to retreat a little bit? And if you have time, generally, I remember after the end of the Cold War, we read reports that NATO was out of date. Events shows the opposite. Now Mr. Trump said that NATO is somehow non-relevant organization for many reasons. I imagine you are not a politician, but it may say something also. You may say something about that. Thank you.
Okay, so let me start first with the question on security situation in the Mediterranean and Middle East, and especially from the perspective of Algeria and Israel. We received very detailed briefings on their national perspectives that, in fact, reflect our own understanding and level of knowledge. We shared understanding of the challenges in the region that countries are facing, and how complex the situation and also volatile is in the whole region. And we used the opportunity of talking to our partners to better understand all these complexities, and we try to identify the ways how we can assist primarily them in increasing their capability to come up with their own local solutions. Obviously, there is no universal solution to be imported into the region, and there is no military-only solution to the problem. So we tried to identify a comprehensive approach how to assist in fighting terrorism, extremism in the region, how to address numerous challenges of social and economic nature. And we all recognize that this will be a long-term agenda for us as well as for the countries in the region. And in terms of a second part of your question, I think I gave partially the answer in my first statement, that I'm strongly convinced that NATO is as relevant today as it was before. It evolves as any other living organism, and it adapts to a new situation. We can obviously argue about the scope, the depth, or the pace of adaptation, but I think the relevance of NATO is not in question.
Terry Schultz with NPR and CBS News. A couple of questions along the lines of my colleagues. Specifically with regard to Russia, when President Putin says that President-elect Trump's priorities align perfectly with his own, does that give you any reason for concern? Are you worried that even words like this might embolden Russia, particularly in Ukraine? Are you simply worried about the effect of this kind of rhetoric? And a more specific military question, with the purge in Turkey and the fact that many of your trusted officers have been recalled, or at least have left their offices. What kind of effect has this had on your readiness and your ability to trust that your Turkish staff can step up and do all the things that the purged officers could do? Thanks.
Well, first, we military try to build our assessments on policies rather than individual separate statements. So I will personally wait for an official new administration policy, and then we can see. On the second part of the question, we have full confidence in our Turkish military colleagues. They are doing their job at the same quality as they did before, even though in slightly lower numbers at this point. But they take all the efforts to fill the gaps, and we can rely on Turkey as an ally as we did before.
Yeah, two comments I'd make on that. First, to the Russians, and much like Peter said, you know, we assess actions and set our posture appropriately. I think that's the first thing, and I think the second is that we've got to address it with strength as well as balance, our posture and the way that we respond to Russia and their malign actions, or perhaps their aggressive actions that they've had in the past, and we'll continue to do that. In terms of Turkey, they stated very clearly their commitment, and I've seen nothing but that as the SACEUR. We work closely with them, and you know, in terms of their personnel, in my headquarters today, we're nearly back to the point that we were post to the, prior to the coup attempt. So they're refilling, these important positions in our headquarters, and I appreciate their effort in that regard.
Thanks, gentlemen. Robin at Reuters. Question for General Pavel and Zakar, and then another question for General Mercier. On the Baltic and Eastern Poland build-up in the spring, I wondered if you'd discussed at all any of the consequences that this might lead to vis-a-vis any Russian reaction. Do you fear some kind of escalation on their side? Is there anything you can say about your understanding of their thinking? And for General Mercier, in the past you've talked about the need for countering A2AD and the need for sophisticated air defenses. Have you made any progress on that, given the situation in the Baltics? What can we expect for this year in terms of ideas, policy, planning? Thank you.
I will start with what you call Baltic build-up. I think we have to go into the sequence. What is the action? What is the reaction? I think the question is not how Russians would react to our action, but to consider that the decision to deploy 4 battle groups to Poland and 3 Baltic countries was in itself a reaction to Russian behavior. It was not NATO who launched support to separatists in eastern Ukraine or annexed Crimea. And Eastern allies were justifiably concerned about Russian actions. So they called for more assurance that collective defense Article 5 will apply in crisis, and they called for more NATO presence on their soil. So that was the reaction. And also we have to consider that Russia announced longer before the announcement of 4 battle groups that they are going to form 3 new divisions in the area. So we really have to measure what is reaction to what. And I believe that the decision to build 4 battle groups is very much appropriate and well measured, not to be provocative, not to be escalatory.
Yeah, if I could briefly on that, I'm pleased with the progress we're making for the forces that will be in the enhanced forward presence. That work with the individual nations and the framework nations, pulling them together, is going well. Again, it's centered, as Peter said, on deterrence and defense, a proportional response. It's not offensive in any way, and that's the first thing I would point out. And secondly, just that we'll be vigilant for whatever response there may be as we go in, and we're planning that as a part of our capability as we enter, and we'll see how it's taken. But again, it's a deterrent force, and I'm confident they'll be able to provide the capabilities that we need there.
Just regarding your question. Your question is linked to what we do, in fact, and to the NATO defense planning process. The NATO defense planning process is the way we look at the capabilities we need in our alliance to deal with the problems today and in the future. This is a very robust process, probably the most robust process that exists today, because based on the level of ambitions laid out in the strategic concept, we define the military requirement. We do that, SACURE and me. SACURE is focusing on the military requirement, looking at the current operations, and I look at the military requirement looking at the full level of ambition. And then we define shortfalls, looking at what exists in the nations. And we're in the process now to do joint consultation with the nations and ask the nations to mitigate the shortfalls and to have the acquisition of the missing capabilities. And there is a priority for the missing capabilities for the current operation, but to look at the missing capabilities for the future. The A2AD system, we can deal with that, but we can deal with that with what we have today, and there is a form of priority looking at the deployment that we have. And again, we look at the new and innovative idea to deal with this system better in the future. And this is the beauty of this process. And this is what we are conducted, and it's working quite well, and it's really working with a huge support from the nation. And this is really the second cycle we run like this, which is a 4-year cycle, and this time we have a huge support from nations. And that's very important, because this is the key to be sure that our alliance will be able to face any kind of challenge in the future.
Vladimir Dobrovolsky from Russian news agency RIA Novosti. I've got a question to General Pavel, because you mentioned the meaningful dialogue with General Gerasimov. So do you have any concrete date? When will you contact him, and what will be the subject that you would like to discuss with him? And another question is, Russian side repeatedly told that NATO rejected its proposal to hold talks of the military experts. Is it still NATO position not to hold the talks between military experts to discuss risk reduction measures? Thank you.
I can tell you that to have a meaningful military dialogue is one of my major issues since I arrived to this headquarters. Since then, I contacted Russian counterparts here in Brussels at least 5 times. The last one was last week, where I offered again a dialogue to start with General Gerasimov, at least at the initial stage through phone conversation, to set clearly the stage for such a dialogue, to set clear rules for it, and also to get a mutual agreement that risk reduction and transparency is the focal point of that initial conversation. I also stressed the view that is different from Russian military, that we cannot start expert-level discussion without first setting the scope for the agenda at the top military level. Because even if we theoretically think about sending experts to Moscow or elsewhere, what will be their mandate? What will be the agenda for their meetings? Will they start talking from a very broad point of view? So we first have to re-establish the contact. We have to re-establish some basic trust. We have to set the agenda, and then we can give our experts a clear task what they are to discuss. And that offer is at the table, and we now expect a reaction from Moscow.
Thank you, Philippe Renier, newspaper Le Soir. I'd like to ask a question again on Russia, but this time on Libya. How do you assess the last moves made by Russia when they met with General Haftar on their air carrier in the Libyan territorial waters? Is that a threat, a new threat in that region, in the Mediterranean? Thank you.
I think it is very natural that Russia is trying within or in line with their recent policies to have more influence in the regions of their interest. The contact with General Haftar may contribute if General Haftar is an official representative of Libya. But I believe that the international community recognizes as an official representative of Libya the government in Tripoli. And in that sense, the effort is not helping. We would obviously welcome participation of any actor who would contribute to the solution. But contacts with just one side are not helpful.
Thank you for your questions. It concludes the press conference for today. Thank you very much.